Juniperous chinensis kaisuka, Hollywood juniper. Juniperous chinensis kaisuka, not bazooka, but kaisuka, Hollywood juniper. One of the most recognizable, artistic of any of the gymnosperms, in my opinion, in the landscape. And part of that, as you just saw looking at the form, is because Hollywood juniper, whether it's 6 feet, gets up to 20 feet tall, it has a twist and a spiral to the entire form of the plant. And I hope you can see that just as Becky pans across. This very dense foliage, very compact, even if it gets 15, 20 feet tall, but it's got a twist and a spiral, very gently, very gracefully to this plant. Beautiful, beautiful specimen, okay? Let's come on in a bit closer. And I think you're gonna find Hollywood juniper to be quite easy to identify. First of all, the foliage type are gonna be scales, scale-like foliage, all right? No sharp prickles on these, very, very supple, very soft. And then notice how dense, how almost three-dimensional the branches are. Extraordinarily dense branches, unlike any other gymnosperm. Very, very dense, almost kind of like coral, okay? Very coral-like in its form, all right? Hopefully you can see the twist, scale-like foliage. Now, if you come in close, there we go. We've got some female cones, or some better ones right there, Becky. Yep. These are the female cones. All right. Now, if you take a note, Juniperous chinensis kaisuka says, hey, this is a cultivar. So cultivars being clones, that means that every Juniperous chinensis kaisuka are going to be female, because cultivars are clones, so all kaisuka cultivars must be female. And this particular one has pearl size, maybe up to marble size female cones, which are really quite large for other junipers, okay? So in review, we've got a twisting, spiraling form of the plant, very dense, coral-like, scale-like foliage, and large pearl to marble sized female cones on this particular cultivar. Oh, hi! Come on, come on. I can't help but resist. I have to lay down on this every time. This is one of the most favorite plants ever. Folks, this is Juniperous Horizontalis. Carpet juniper or just ground juniper, horizontal juniper. Lots of common names for this. The best is probably blue rug. Blue rug because of the color of the foliage and the form, it being a ground cover. We'll talk about that in a second, all right? Now, let me get up from here. But the first thing about the form, Juniperous horizontalis is a ground cover. Only 2 ground cover junipers on this first plant list, okay? Becky, if you come on in, zoom on in a bit. And what I want to show you is the foliage type of Juniperous horizontalis are scales, scale-like foliage. That is different than the other ground cover juniper. So an easy way already to separate them, all right? Well, what about length? Oh, I can just break one. Height of the plant, all right? Look at this. The height of the foliage on Juniperous horizontalis, and again, there's a lot of cultivar variations, but the height is going to be about 2 inches, not 4, 6, or 8 like some of the other ground covers. So 2-inch tall foliage, scale-like, very soft, and it forms this really dense carpet-like ground cover in the landscape. A great example also of a ground cover that changes color in the wintertime. We've talked a bit about that with gymnosperms, but this one will actually have this bronze or this burgundy color or hue to the foliage. Very neat about Juniperous horizontalis. There are both male and female cultivars available as well, so you can or cannot see small female cones. This particular cultivar does not have one. Juniperous horizontalis, ground juniper, or horizontal juniper. All right, Juniperous conferta, shore juniper. Juniperous conferta, shore juniper. Now, as Becky's panning around this bed, first thing I hope you quickly notice, this is a ground cover. This is one of the few ground cover gymnosperms that we're going to do, Juniperous conferta, shore juniper. Now, one thing of note about this particular bed, this planting of shore juniper has been here at least 20 years, okay? So the height of the plant is a bit misleading because after 20 years, this plant has grown over itself, so it's actually gotten taller than it actually is, all right? Another thing to note about Juniperous conferta is there are many cultivars of it. Some could easily be 15, 18 inches tall, while others are only 4 to 6 inches tall. And that's one of the reasons to always remember that the height of any particular plant is not just dependent upon age, but also by the cultivar, all right? But for the purpose of this class, how are we going to separate and identify Juniperous conferta? Well, number one, it's a ground cover, all right? So here I have removed a sample, and to know if it's a ground cover just by looking at a sample, how would you do that? Well, all the foliage is on one side, the other side is naked or bare, as it was laying across the ground. If this were a shrub or a tree, it would have foliage out on both sides. So, looking at a sample, you can know if its growth form by if the foliage is only on one side or if it's on both, okay? So, here we've got a creeping ground cover, and I'll lay it down. Becky can zoom in. The foliage type for Juniperous conferta are awls, A-W-L. Those awl-like or juvenile foliage. And notice they're green on one side and then glaucous blue on the other. Very characteristic, very, very nice. And you can see that all throughout this plant. Awl-like foliage, blue on the inside, green on the outside. And then the height of this particular sample is only about 3 to 4 inches tall. 3 to 4 inches tall. But again, some cultivars may easily get 6 or 8, 10, 12 inches, all right? Ground cover, all like foliage, and we're gonna say 4 to 6 inches in height. Thuya plicata, green giant. Thuya plicata, green giant arborvitae. Now, this is going to be a tree, one of the more common screening gymnosperms that's used in landscapes. We'll talk about that in lecture, all right? So how are we going to identify Thuya plicata green giant? Well, first was the form. This is a tree form, but it's very characteristically pyramidal, broad at the base, tapering to the point. So it's very much like a pyramid. So pyramidal growth form for this tree, okay? Now the second thing, coming into the foliage, we'll take a little sample. Now, with a lot of our gymnosperms that have flattened foliage like this is called a spray, S-P-R-A-Y, a spray. And a spray is just a term meaning a flattened branch, okay? So when we take a look at arborvitae, these sprays are going to be individually about 8 to 10 inches long. Notice how really dark green the individual leaves are on those sprays. And my dry skin, by the way. Okay? Now, if you can zoom in, right here, Becky. You see, maybe close there. If you can see the individual little scales, and there you are, really nice. See the individual little scales up and down these little branchlets? Folks, every scale is an individual leaf. Every scale is an individual leaf. So if you look, the leaves are actually 3 thick. So 2 on the outside and 1 in the center. These little tiny scale leaves right there, all right? Very dark green, scale-like foliage. Scale-like foliage. Now the other neat thing, when you encounter these in person, all right? The foliage of Thuya plicata green giant, when you crush it, oh, it has a wonderful, sweet, sweet fragrance. A wonderful, sweet fragrance. If you can smell it, okay? But you might can't on video, but you will when you see it in person, okay? So, the last thing I would, as you pan across, I would have you take a look, and I hope that you can see that the sprays are coming out horizontally. See how the sprays are coming out horizontally directly towards us? All right? Dark green, smelling, very fragrant, scale-like foliage, pyramidal growth, all are signs that this is Thuya plicata green giant. All right? Here we've got golden thread moss, Chemiciferous Piscifera Folifera aurea. Truly one of the most unique and fun names to pronounce. All right, let's do it again. Chemiciferous Piscifera Folifera aurea. Now, Chemiciferous Piscifera is the species. Folifera means thread-like or thread moss, and aurea means yellow. So you can probably get an idea of that by looking at these thread-like branches that are yellow. Folifera aurea. All right. So this is going to be a shrub form. Now, some of these thread mosses can easily get 8, 10, 12 feet high in a rounded dome, all right? Very large shrubs, but typically more in the 4 to 6 foot range. But guys, talk about super easy. I'm going to take one of these small branches. The foliage type is going to be awls and scales, a mix of awl-like foliage and scales. But look at the thread-like nature of the branchlets. These thread-like branchlets that are yellow in color. This is the only yellow foliage form gymnosperm we've done. I'm not going to show you any other yellow form for this list, or maybe not at all right? So yellow, thread-like foliage, and then just look at the habit. Really soft textured, really nice, flowing, gracefully pendulous branches, which makes this a very interesting and I hope very easy plant to identify. Chemiciferous Piscifera Folifera aurea. All right, Cryptomeria Japonica, Japanese cedar. Cryptomeria Japonica, Japanese cedar. This was going to be a tree form, all right? And I think it's going to be pretty easy for you to identify, all right? Come on in. First thing, looking at the foliage type is going to be awls, A-W-L, awls. Remember, with our gymnosperms, we've got scale, needle, awls as the three predominant different types of foliage, and the fourth one being linear, okay? Now, awl-like foliage, and all of the foliage is awl-like foliage. You like that? All right? This one does not have a mix of different foliage types, which is common with other gymnosperms, all right? Now, to touch it, it is not sharp, but it feels like a Brillo pad. If you've ever touched or used a Brillo pad, which I'm sure you probably have, that's kind of what it feels like, all right? So, very distinctive awl-like foliage. Now, let's take a look at these cone structures. Now, right here, these are the female strobili, or what will be the female strobili, the female cones on Cryptomeria japonica, all right? One of the neat aspects about Cryptomeria, it retains its old cones. It will also retain its old foliage, so it's not uncommon at all on the lower branches, which you can pan up right here, Becky, if you can see, and see all the old foliage, all right? And if not, I've got some, oh, there we go, look at that. See all the old foliage? It's kind of like, this is the hoarder tree. This tree hoards all of its old foliage and cones. It doesn't want to get rid of them, and that can be a neat ID feature. May not be the best aesthetically pleasing tree, but it is a very neat ID feature, all right? And I do not see as, oh, yes we do, right here. An example of, I'm gonna let that up. These are, put it against my jacket. That is the male strobili. Those small bud-like structures are the male strobili on Cryptomeria japonica, in addition to the rounded female strobili. Cryptomeria japonica, all like foliage. And by the way, what is the term when a tree has both male and female, or in this case, pollen and cone producing structures? Monoecious. Monoecious, having both sex parts, if you will, on the same plant. Cryptomeria japonica, Japanese cedar. Yeah. Cupresus Arizonica. Cupresus Arizonica, Arizona cypress. This is one of my absolute favorite gymnosperms, and I'll only say that about 10 more times, I promise. Cupresus Arizonica. This is one of only 2 species of Cupresus that are going to be common in the landscape, so there are not many of these species to separate, okay? And we're fortunate here on campus to have some large specimens of Arizona cypress. So the first thing I want to show you is just the scale and the size of this tree, but then look at the beautiful bark. When Cupresus Arizonica gets large, the bark peels and it flakes and it looks almost like eucalyptus or maybe a crepe myrtle. Very interesting bark, all right? But how do we identify it from the foliage, all right? Come on in, let's take a look. Now, the neat thing, if you can see it against the contrast of my jacket, I hope, the individual branches and the leaves on these branches are 3-dimensional, all right? I'm gonna drop that there. 3-dimensional branches. The scales, the tiny little scales on those branches are the leaves. So these have tiny scale-like leaves. You'll also likely notice that the tip of these 3-dimensional branchlets are bluish in color, glaucous, glaucish blue in color just on the tips, okay? This is the only gymnosperm that has this 3-dimensional foliage, and maybe I'll cast it up against the side of the bark here, okay? So you can see that. Now, while we're here, I also want to point out another feature, and that is the male strobili. The male pollen-producing strobili are these yellow-headed tips, about the size of the end of a match head. These small yellowish structures at the end are the male strobili. Those will produce the pollen, all right? Now, as far as the female strobili, remember, gymnosperms do not have fruit, so we'll only refer to them in cones or strobili. I've got another sample that I'll bring up and hopefully cast that against. Becky, does that look okay?
Oh, yeah.
Here are the female strobili, about the size of large marbles, smaller than a golf ball, but these really neat small cones, and that is the female cones, female strobili. And if I can get that in the shot with the male strobili, and you see the 3-dimensional structure of the branches, all key features of Cupresus Arizonica, Arizona cypress. Pinus Palustris, Loblolly Pine. Pinus Palustris, Loblolly Pine. Another one of our pine species, another native to North Carolina and to the eastern United States. Just as a point of reference to kind of put in context the importance of loblolly pine, there are over 30 million acres of managed loblolly pine just in the southeastern United States. So this is the tree that predominantly gives us the paper and the lumber that we rely on very much. But there's also horticultural aspects to loblolly pine as well. Pinus Palustris, we'll talk about those in lecture. Now, how do we identify this plant? Well, the trees themselves certainly get 75, 80 feet tall. They're tall trees, all right, no big surprise there. But one of the first things I want you to notice, if you can zoom in here on the branches, notice the branches of Pinus Palustris are very scaly. They are not smooth, all right? Some of our pines have smooth branches, but not Pinus Palustris. Very, very rough, scaly branches, all right? Well, you also know with pines, what do you look for? Number of needles per fascicle. And here we go, needles in 3s. Needles in 3s for loblolly pine, and the length is about 8 inches. Pretty spot on, uniform for loblollies to have 8-inch needles. Again, plus or minus a bit depending on the age of the tree, the health of the tree, but needles in 3s, about 8 inches in length, okay? Now, the last thing I'll mention other than the needles and the scaly branches are the cones, all right? If you come in and zoom in on these cones, my goodness, these cones are going to be a light brown or gray in color. They're only about 3 to maybe 4 inches long, as you can see here. But unlike some pine cones that are soft, you can squeeze them. These, you squeeze these and you're going to bleed, all right? Super, super sharp. And that's because each scale is tipped with a very, very sharp barb. And you can likely see those barbs there in the video very nicely. Very, very sharp. So, Pinus taeda, loblolly pine, needles in threes, 8 inches long, very sharp cones. All right, another pine, Pinus strobus, eastern white pine. Pinus strobus, eastern white pine. All right, we've got a lot to talk about in the lecture about our pines and the 7 native pines that are the state tree of North Carolina. All right, but first let's focus in on how to identify the eastern white pine. Now, one of the first key things, this is really good to do on young trees like this one, all right, is to easily count the age of the tree based on the growth pattern, which is very specific to white pine, all right? And by that, if you come on in, all right, notice the scars here, and here, and here, and then here, and then up, and up, and up. The branches of eastern white pine, Pinus strobus, are whorled or verticillate around the stem, all right? And right here, all these branches this year grew, and then the shoot grew the next year, the next set of branches, it grew up, the next set. So standing back, you can easily see the branching age, or the age of the tree based on the branches. That's one cool way of recognizing Pinus strobus from a distance. One of the other things on young trees, notice how smooth the bark is. All right, very smooth bark on Pinus strobus. Now I'll show you in just a moment that as they get older, that feature will go away a bit, okay? Now, let's talk about the foliage. Remember with pines, the key thing with the foliage is going to be to count the number of needles per fascicle and then to measure the length of those needles, okay? So I've got some needles here. And if you can see here on the table from them spread out, these needles are in clusters of 5, all right? 5 needles per fascicle. It's one of the only pines with 5 needles per fascicle. And these fascicles on this particular tree are only about 4 inches long. But on eastern white pine, the needles can easily be maybe 6, 7 inches long on different trees, okay? But the key thing here, 5 needles. One of the other key features about the fascicles of eastern white pine is on the back side of each needle, and I'll show you this more closely in photographs, is glaucus. There's a white band of glaucus wax on the back side of the needles, which kind of gives it a bluish green color. 5 needles, white on one side, smooth bark, and then the cones. The cones of Pinus strobus are going to be 6 to 8 inches long, usually 4 to 6 most commonly. Take a look at this one. Boom, boom, this one's exactly 6. Very elongated, very long, skinny cones covered in sap. And if you squeeze it, it does not hurt, but it does make your hands very sticky, okay? So, 5 needles, a bluish white line down the back, smooth bark, whorled branches, elongated cones, and then as we finish up, we're going to pan right next door and take a look at an old white pine. Come on, Becky. And this bark is a much larger, older white pine, and notice how the bark is now blocky and flaky. It's not smooth, okay? So that feature of smooth bark will go away eventually. Eastern white pine, Pinus strobus. All right, Pinus Palustris, longleaf pine. Pinus Palustris, longleaf pine. All right, so I think this is going to be pretty easy for you to identify. All right, let's come straight in and get to the foliage. But before I show you the needles, I do want to show you this very distinct bud on Pinus Palustris. See that bud? 1 inch long, and it's very pubescent, white. 1 inch long. Becky, how does that look? Yeah. Okay, 1 inch white bud, very characteristic of winter form of Pinus Palustris. Now let's take a look at the fascicles. All right, by the way, look at this. Notice how the stem on Pinus Palustris is also very, very rough. Very, very rough, scaly skin bark on Pinus Palustris. Now, looking at these fascicles, they are three needles per fascicle. 1, 2, 3. And always check it again. Another fascicle. 1, 2, 3. All right, here they are against my jacket, if you can see that. What about length? All right, well, where's my where's my nifty little tape measure? And these are, bam, at 1 foot. Right there, and even 1 foot. Now, I've seen them easily be 16. I've seen them 18 inches long, okay? But so far, 3-needle fascicles. You've got Pinus Palustris at 12 inches. You've got Pinus Tayeta at 8 inches. And as we continue to add new pines that have 3 needles, we'll continue to use the length of those needles as well as some other features to separate our pines. But right now, 3 needles, 12 inches long. Now, Pinus Palustris will have the largest cone of any pine east of the Mississippi River, okay? And this one is still fairly small, but it gives you an idea of the size of Pinus Palustris. I will show you examples in lecture of other specimens that are 2 to 3 times this size. Pinus Palustris, longleaf pine. All right, Cedrus deodara, deodar cedar. Cedrus deodara, deodar cedar. Now, first thing about Cedrus deodara, this is going to be a tree. Now, as we've talked about before, one of the key ID features for separating our gymnosperms is to determine, is this a tree, is this a shrub, or is this a ground cover, okay? So as you've seen in the pan up of this is certainly a large tree. Now, a couple of quick, pretty easy identifying features about Cedrus deodara, deodar cedar, all right? First of all, the foliage type. What is the foliage type of this gymnosperm? Well, these are going to be needles. And needles are 2 inches long. And these needles, very specifically, are clustered on these dwarf shoots. And you see those dwarf shoots, how the foliage is clustered just like this. Okay? So, foliage, 2 inches, needle-like, clustered on dwarf shoots. And then at the tip, if you can see this against my jacket, the tip of the needles of Cedrus deodara are going to be bluish. And that bluish wax is called glaucus. All right, glaucus is a term to mean bluish wax. And that's very common for the needles of Cedrus deodara, out on the tips. Now, I'll have to show you the male and female strobili in photographs and in lecture because they aren't present on the tree at this time of the year. But summary points for Cedrus deodara: a tree, needle-like leaves, clustered on dwarf shoots, 2 inches long, the tips of the foliage on the end of the branches, bluish in color. Cedrus deodara. All right, here we've got Taxus X media, U, Y-E-W, Taxus X media, U. Now, the first thing I would just note, again, looking at form first, Taxus X media is going to be a shrub, all right? So a shrub-like growth, often 4 to 6 by 6 to 8 wide, just to give you a size range for how commonly large these will get. There are lots of Taxus species and more Taxus cultivars, okay? So we're going to only look at this particular type and form, and I'm not going to vary from this and expect you to know others, okay? Now, let's come take a look at the foliage. And this one is going to be our first example of linear foliage. All right, just as a reminder, there are 4 types of foliage for gymnosperms: needle, awl, scale, and linear. And linear are going to be less than 2 inches long, nearly parallel sides. And there aren't going to be many members of the gymnosperms we're going to do that have this type. So here with Taxus, if you note, these linear leaves are green on the surface. Maybe we just zoom in on that. All right, green on the surface, and very slowly, so it's not blurry, I'll turn it over, and they're a light green below. Light green. They're not really white, just light green below, very dark green on top. All right. Now another thing, if we can zoom in on the actual stem, do you see the?
Here we go.
There we go. Oh, you're right there. Do you notice the little ridges? Oh yes, the ridges on the stem itself. These ridges are actually decurrent leaf bases. We've talked about that in the vegetative morphology lab. And the decurrent leaf bases, and I'll also provide some photographs of this, are where the petiole tissue extends down the stem, creating a square or some type of ridged look to the stem. Very unique. One of the first times we've seen that this semester with, oh, that's right, that's good right there, Becky. Yeah, see the stem that ridges down the stem, decurrent leaf bases, linear leaves, green above, and you leave it right there, and light green below. Taxus ex media, the U.